Morning, everybody. It's me, Victor Hale from Hailstorm Gaming. Just wanted to give you this little bit of an announcement as well as an update from the previous day. So, the other day, as you saw, I was doing my first couple of live streams of Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. And while I continued it into Sunday towards the morning of, I wanted to discuss that a little bit. So, I wanted to get to chapter 10, or rather end game, as fast as I could. And one of the things that I had to do was to prepare. Because one of the things that I want to discuss is how end game should go. So, you really need your units to second or third tier by the time end game starts. And the reason why is because you're going to be doing an entire part. Ike's army and the Crimean army, basically. And those guys are going to be with you practically the entire game. You pretty much got all the time in the world to help out with those units. Micaiah's army, however, not so much. You only got the first part, and then a couple of skirmishes in the second part, and then the whole third part is where you basically you go back to Micaiah. And by that time, the way the endgame ends is exactly how it begins in part 3. You want your units as good as possible. And so one of the other things that I like to do is to make sure that even though the Black Knight is going to be there in the final game, you want to have every one of your units up to par as much as possible. Use as much bonus experience for those guys. However, when it comes to finances and all that, don't spend all your money. Reason I'm telling you this is because when it comes to Zahark and them are eventually going to go back to Ike's army by the time that part 3 begins. When part 3 begins, you actually have the option of deploying Zahark and Jill, and they will be recruited somehow by one of the units that are going to be there when you face off against them. When you do this, they'll go back to Ike's army. And at that point, you're going to need and if you're going to have an Ike's army, when you do this, they're going to be going back, and you don't really have much sword masters. You really need Edward to be up to snuff to face off against not only Zahark, but possibly others. And on top of this, you also need to be able to finish what you started when it comes to your supports. And the way that it goes for me when it comes to supports is I like to have canonical pairings. On the other hand, there's one pairing that I usually like to have as well. So Nyla and Raphael is a pretty good pair because Nyla has a wind affinity, and then there's the heaven affinity in Raphael. Raphael is pretty bad. There are not that many maps with a heaven affinity, so he's going to be out of his element for quite some time. Nyla, however, there are at least a couple of them that he's going to benefit from. And there are also different kinds of like footings, like ground, grass, desert, water, swamp, etc. In those instances, you're going to want to utilize whatever you can. And as you saw in the previous chapter, Raphael doesn't have flying element. So I don't know what that means entirely. It could be that he doesn't have the weaknesses of a flying unit, and therefore he won't be really penalized by bows, or he'll have the penalties of bow and wind, but he won't be able to fly, and that means low movement. Very, very bad. And as Nyla said in that chapter, you want to keep them close. You do. You want them close. Anyway, so aside from that, the other thing I want to talk about is endgame itself. You want the Black Knight on that squad when you go to endgame. The reason being is because in part 2 or 3, I believe it's part 2, Ike is going to be facing off against Micaiah's army. When this happens, the Black Knight is going to be on that battlefield, and Ike is going to have a confrontation with him. The only way you're going to get that chance is if you have him in endgame. That's all you need, is to have him in the endgame, in the part 1 endgame, When you get there and you finally defeat the end game or whatever, you're going to want to make sure that the Black Knight survives as well, by the way. You need to make sure he survives. When Ike goes to meet him, however, I believe you're allowed to beat him. I'm not entirely too sure, but I believe you're allowed to beat him in that point. However, the main thing with him is that when Ike goes to face off against the Black Knight, you probably don't want him killed. You want him to face off against him, but you don't want him to die just then. Or maybe or it's possible that he still manages to live regardless of his status, because he is going to be a final boss in the final, the final end game, the final chapter, basically. There's a whole end game part, the final part of this entire story. When you get there, there's going to be a duel between Ike and the Black Knight. And of course, you're going to want to be prepared for that too. Ike really benefits with Nihil. He really loves Nihil. So you're going to want that. And on top of this, you're going to want to make sure that when the Black Knight face off against Ike, you also have to account for the fact that because the armor blessing is gone, you can beat him with a hammer. Like it or not, you can beat him with a hammer, but it's canonically you want to utilize ether. On the other hand, you want to make sure that you get all the conversations you can with the boss of that chapter. Not just the Black Knight, but the other boss that's going to be there. I won't reveal who, but you'll be finding out about him in part 2 and 3. Now then, aside from that, part, so to speak, there is one other thing you need to know. When you go to, if you've faced off against him in Endgame, and faced off against him in that battle between Ike and the Black Knight, and then you beat him in the final encounter with the Black Knight, then there's a whole segment known as Ike's Memories. That opens up on the first playthrough. So no worries about that. That's all you have to do to get that one unlocked. However, in order to get the secret ending with Soren, you have to have beaten the game twice. There are some things you can do to get some of the requirements in the first playthrough, but not two things. There's, in one instance, the one thing, Soren needs to be able to face off against Micaiah in one of the same battles between Soren and Micaiah in part 3, basically. I think it is part 3. Once you get to that point, however, the other thing you have to do is have Micaiah face off against Peleus. And that's the problem right there. In part 1, you don't get the option to save Peleus. In part 1, in the first playthrough, you are forced to watch Peleus get killed. So there's your spoiler for today. The other thing you have to do is the other thing that, because that happens, because Peleus dies, there's a certain moment with Almeida in which she basically gets enraged, and you have to save them. Now, there are different interactions with Almeida when you, there are different interactions with Almeida depending on the option you choose. There's the first one, which is Micaiah kills Peleus. Then there's the second option where Tyranio kills him. And, if you have Micaiah kill him, however, then that means not only does Almeida really get pissed off and very desperate, she goes fucking insane. And because of this, Kurthnaga intervenes. This is why he was a pilgrim. He wanted to take care of his sister. That's why he went away from Goldua to go and protect his sister, because he wanted to make sure she was safe and didn't do anything crazy. Nasir even confronts her by the end of this, talking about why it is that that shit happened in her circumstances. And yeah. So yeah. Aside from that, however, there is one other thing there is a couple of other things that I really have to spoil in the first playthrough because there can be misconceptions when you play it the first time. In the first playthrough, there are scenes where Sephiron faces off against the entire army. But usually in the second playthrough, there's a build up to this. There are a couple of scenes that are scattered around towards the end game, and those ones involve Yune. Basically, Yune gets involved with the plot very very late. However, when she does, there are memory sequences that she remembers that are related to Sephiron. And you don't get to see those unless you play the game a second time. In the first playthrough, you don't get to see these. And even more importantly, you don't discover what happens in Benyon, basically. So you don't uncover the truth. And even worse is that when you face off against Sephiron, you're going to find out the cruel truth about him and how long he's actually lived, and about who he actually is. The other thing you also have to remember is that he has lived a long time and he is a very troubled soul. He's just wanted to die. He was given a blessing of eternal life, so to speak. However, that made it more horrible for him because he had to live through so many tragedies, including the Serenus massacre, and it killed him inside. And so because of what happened, he plotted this entire sequence of events. And because of what his planning sought him, because of what his planning had wrought, there unfortunately was there's a scene as well as an event that does not transpire unless you do the second playthrough. He inevitably dies. Something else will happen if you beat the game a second time. However, I'm not going to spoil what happens at that point. I will say that because of what happens, there's something that can't happen at the very end. And the true ending of this game cannot take place because of it. So unfortunately, you're locked out of it in your first playthrough. However, if you somehow make the game think that you're playing this for the third or second time, then you can see those sequences. However, even though I technically have like the cheat code on or whatever, it doesn't work. Anyway, so if I'm lucky, we may be able to see all of them, but that may not be. Anyway, so that's pretty much it. Aside from that, there is one thing that I also have to tell you. When part 2 begins, the way that the plot thickens, there's going to be instances of the extended scripts that I'm going to have to pull from. I'm going to have to go into like Big Clingy's playthrough to figure out each one of the scenes in which there was information that alluded to the inspiration and whatnot and the villain of that entire thing, and I will have to go in depth with that because there are certain sequences with the extended scripts that you cannot find anywhere else. So you need to know ahead of time what those extended scripts would tell, basically, because they are not available in the English version. They're available in the Japanese version, but not in the English version. But yeah, anyway, so aside from that, there are a couple of like touching moments between Ike and the group that are talking about like how much everybody's a dork, but that's pretty much it. But anyway, this is my update for now. I'm going to begin my live stream on Friday. However, I'm going to prep up one of my save files to have all the characters like. Actually, I'm gonna prep up both of them. They're all going to be like promoted, hopefully max statted, but mostly promoted to their highest capacity. However, the only two people that are not able to get to their third tiers are Soth and Micaiah. Those ones are locked to story mode rank ups. So because of that, they can never go to Sage or whatever until a certain chapter in part 2 or 3. So yeah. Now that we have that out of the way, pretty much that's pretty much it for today. I will, in closing, like to dedicate anybody who's part of the military and anyone who is celebrating Memorial Day, and I hope everyone's doing well. So, all you veterans out there, all you soldiers, all you people who are there for America, I wish you the best. However, and anybody who wishes harm on them, I do not support. If they are doing something wrong, I do not condone it, but I still hold respect and I still hope the best. So, happy Memorial Day, everybody, and I hope everyone's doing well. See ya.